The air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of late July humidity, diesel exhaust, and the sweet, cloying smell of desperation. It was 1978, and the farming world was drunk on optimism. Russian grain deals had sent corn and soybean prices into the stratosphere, and every farmer with a pulse and a half-decent line of credit was looking to get bigger, faster, newer. I was standing near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my old Chevy C20, watching the spectacle. Men I'd known my whole life, men whose fathers had scraped through the Depression with a team of mules and a prayer, were bidding against each other with reckless abandon. They were throwing around numbers that would have made their granddads choke on their chewing tobacco. The auctioneer, a fast-talking showman named Slim Perkins, was working the crowd like a maestro, his sing-song chant coaxing another $1,000, then another, out of wallets fattened by bank loans. The main event was a brand-new, still-gleaming Steiger Cougar third. It sat in the center of the lot like a giant green god, its 8 massive tires dwarfing everything around it. The articulated body, the sheer scale of the thing, was a statement. It screamed power, progress, and debt. Dale Peterson, his face already sunburnt red from pride, was the one who placed the winning bid. He'd only been farming on his own for 5 years, having taken over his father-in-law's place, but he acted like he'd invented turning dirt. He swaggered over to the Steiger, slapping one of its tires like it was the flank of a prize bull. A few of the other younger farmers clapped him on the back, their faces a mixture of envy and admiration. I just shook my head and took a slow drag from my cigarette. I wasn't there to buy. I was there to watch, to listen, and maybe, if I got lucky, to pick up a few spare parts for my own iron. My iron wasn't new. It wasn't shiny, but it was mine. Every last bolt and grease zerk was paid for. My prize tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a side console model with the power shift transmission. I'd bought it used 10 years ago, and I knew every cough and sputter of its 404 cubic inch diesel engine. It was my office, my workhorse, and my partner. Alongside it in my shed sat my father's old Farmall M, still earning its keep on the auger and hay rake, and a Gleaner F combine that, while not pretty, could still take off a clean crop if you knew how to humor her. They were my tools, and I owed no man a single dime on any of them. Slim Perkins moved on from the big-ticket items to the miscellaneous lots, pallets of old junk that most farmers wouldn't waste a second glance on. But for me, this was the real reason I'd come. One man's scrap is another man's salvation. Slim pointed to a greasy, dust-covered pile of hydraulic cylinders, pumps and hoses, stacked on a weathered wooden pallet. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this fine collection of hydraulic components? Who'll give me $20? 20, gimme 20. Got 20, now 30. $30 bill, who'll give me 30? My hand went up. I knew there was a Rusa Master injection pump buried in that pile that would fit my 40-20, and having a spare on the shelf was cheap insurance. Got 30 from Frank Miller. Now 40. Who'll give me 40? A voice, slick with arrogance, cut through the auctioneer's patter. Better let him have it, Slim. He's going to need it to keep that museum of his running. It was Dale Peterson. He was standing with his little clique, a smug grin plastered on his face. The others snickered. I felt a slow burn start in my gut, but I kept my face as still as a stone. I didn't turn to look at him. I just kept my eyes on Slim. $30 is the bid, I said, my voice low and even. Going once? Come on, Frank, Dale continued, his voice louder now, making sure everyone could hear. Why are you wasting your time with that old junk? The bank's loaning money hand over fist. You could trade in that old green relic and get yourself a real tractor, something with some horsepower, something with a cab and air conditioning. This time I did turn. I looked him square in the eye. Dale was 10 years younger than me, soft around the middle, with hands that looked like they'd never seen the inside of a greasy engine block. That old green relic, as you call it, has put food on my family's table for a decade, Dale, I said, my voice carrying in the sudden quiet. It started every cold morning I've ever asked it to, and it's never sent me a bill in the mail. Dale scoffed. You can't expand with equipment like that. You can't get ahead. It's the modern age, Frank. Get big or get out. That's what the magazines all say. I read the magazines, I replied, taking a step toward him. The smell of his cheap cologne mixed unpleasantly with the honest scent of oil and earth. I also read my account book. You see that big green monster you just bought? It's a fine machine, a beautiful machine, but you don't own it. The bank owns it. That banker, Mr. Henderson down at Farmers Trust, he owns your tractor. He owns your new combine. And with the note you just signed, he probably owns a piece of your soul too. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Dale's confident smirk faltered. Every morning, I continued, when I climb up on my 40 Hrs and 20, the only man I have to answer to is myself. When you climb up into that fancy air-conditioned cab of yours, you're working for Mr. Henderson. Every bushel you combine, a piece of it is his. Every acre you plough, you're doing it on his time. That debt is a chain, Dale, and it gets heavier with every payment. I'd rather be a free man sweating on old iron than a comfortable slave in a brand-new cab. I turned back to the auctioneer. $30, I repeated firmly. Slim, seeing the tension, moved it along quickly. $30 going once, going twice. Sold. To Frank Miller for $30. I walked over, paid the cashier my $30 in cash, and started loading the greasy parts into the bed of my truck. Dale and his friends watched me for a minute, then turned and walked back toward his new Steiger, their laughter sounding a little forced this time. As I hefted the heavy injection pump, I looked over at that giant tractor. It was already tagged, not with a scrap tag, not yet. It was tagged with the invisible lien of the bank, a mark of ownership that was far more permanent than any coat of paint. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what happened next, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like that, who stuck to his guns and his old ways when everyone else was chasing the new and shiny? A man who valued being debt-free more than being impressive? Let me know in the comments below, because men like him are a dying breed, and their stories need to be told. The years that immediately followed that auction were a strange time. The boom kept booming. Corn hit $3 a bushel and stayed there. Soybeans flirted with $7. You couldn't drive down a county road without seeing a new grain bin going up or a new piece of equipment sitting in a farmyard, so bright it hurt your eyes to look at it in the sun. The local John Deere and International Harvester dealerships were doing land office business. They couldn't get tractors and combines in fast enough. For Dale Peterson, it was like printing money. That big Steiger of his could pull a 30-foot field cultivator, eating up acres at a pace my 40 South 20 could only dream of. He worked day and night, bought the 80 acres to the north of him, then rented another quarter section a mile down the road. He was the poster boy for the new era of farming. He was featured in the local paper, standing in front of his new International 1480 combine with its 20-foot grain head, talking about efficiency and economies of scale. He bought a new house in town for his wife and kids, a brick ranch style with a 2-car garage. He was winning and everyone knew it. And me? I was just trying to hold on. I wasn't falling behind, not really. I was making a profit. But my profits were quiet. I didn't spend them on new iron. I spent them on security. I paid off the last of the mortgage on our 240-acre farm, the same land my grandfather had bought in 1922. The day I walked out of the bank with the deed in my hand, free and clear, was one of the proudest days of my life. But nobody threw a party. The paper didn't write an article about it. To the outside world, I was just Frank Miller, the old-timer who was too stubborn or too scared to keep up. The whispers at the co-op were constant. "Poor Frank," they'd say, shaking their heads as I loaded sacks of seed into my old Chevy. "He's going to get left in the dust. Can't make a living on a small farm with old equipment anymore." My own son, Mark, was starting to believe it. He was 16, and all he could see was Dale Peterson's new Ford pickup roaring past our farm, kicking up a cloud of dust, while he was stuck helping me grease the zerks on a combine that was older than he was. "Dad," he'd said one afternoon, his voice full of teenage frustration, "why don't we get a new tractor? The Jensen's just got a new 440 with a sound guard body. It's got a radio and everything. We could cover so much more ground." I stopped turning the wrench and wiped the grease from my hands with an old rag. "Mark, that everything you're talking about comes with a payment book thicker than a phone book. This Gleaner," I said, slapping its faded orange side, "is ours. The 4020 is ours. This land is ours. There's a peace of mind in that, son, that's worth more than any radio." He just kicked at a dirt clod and muttered, "Yeah, but it's embarrassing." That stung more than any of Dale's taunts. The real test came during the spring planting of 79. I was out in the north field, pulling my 6-row John Deere 7000 planter with the 4020. The ground was perfect, just the right amount of moisture, and I was making good time. The old tractor was singing its usual throaty song, the diesel engine humming along under load. Then, without warning, the song changed. It became a harsh, metallic scream, followed by a sickening lurch that threw me against the steering wheel. The tractor shuddered to a dead stop. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of birds and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I climbed down, my boots sinking into the soft, tilled earth. A dark, viscous river of 90-weight gear oil was pouring from the tractor's belly, pooling on the ground like black blood. I knew instantly what it was. The transmission. Something catastrophic had let go inside that heavy cast-iron housing. My stomach turned to a cold, hard knot. This wasn't a simple fix. This was a farm killer, happening at the worst possible time. Every day I wasn't planting was a day of lost yield, lost income. Dale Peterson drove by an hour later in his shiny pickup. He slowed down, rolled down his window, and looked at my dead tractor sitting in the middle of the field. He didn't even have to say anything. The pitying, "I told you so" look on his face was enough. He just gave a little shake of his head and drove on. There was no calling a dealer mechanic. The bill would have been astronomical, and they'd have told me the tractor wasn't worth fixing, that I should just trade in the carcass on a new one. That wasn't an option. So I did the only thing I could do. I went to work. I walked the 2 miles back to the house, got the Farmall M, and used it and a heavy chain to drag the crippled 4020 back to my machine shed. That night, under the stark glare of a single 100-watt bulb, the surgery began. Splitting a tractor of that size is no small feat. It's a heavy, greasy, dangerous job. I used floor jacks and wooden blocks, carefully, painstakingly, separating the massive engine from the transmission housing. The smell of hot metal and burnt oil filled the shed. For the next week, my farm was closed for business. My machine shed became an operating room. I drained the remaining fluid, unbolted the shifter housing, and with the help of a chain hoist, lifted the heavy gear assembly out. The carnage inside was worse than I'd feared. The main pinion shaft had sheared clean in two, and in the process had taken out half the teeth on first and reverse gear. It was a mess of broken steel and metal shavings. This is where that $30 pallet of auction parts came in. I spent a whole day digging through the greasy pile, my hands stained black, until I found what I was looking for. It wasn't a complete transmission, but there were gears, shafts, and bearings from a similar model. They weren't perfect, but they were usable. I cleaned every part in a bucket of gasoline, scrubbing away years of grime until the steel shone under the light. I consulted my well-worn I&T shop manual, its pages soft and stained with the ghosts of 100 other repairs. Night after night, I worked. My wife would bring me out a sandwich and a thermos of hot coffee, her face etched with worry. Mark would come out and watch for a while, handing me wrenches, his earlier embarrassment replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. He saw the sweat pouring down my face, the focus in my eyes, the methodical way I laid out each nut and bolt on a clean rag. He was seeing a side of his father he hadn't understood before, not just a farmer, but a mechanic, an engineer, a man who could take a broken machine and, with his own two hands, will it back to life. Finally, after 7 long days and nights, it was done. I bolted the two halves of the tractor back together, reconnected the fuel lines and wiring, and filled the transmission with fresh, high-guard fluid. The moment of truth had come. I climbed up into the familiar seat, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The engine turned over once, twice, then roared to life, filling the shed with its beautiful, deafening noise. I eased the power shift lever into first gear. With a gentle clunk, the tractor moved forward. I shifted to second, then third, then reverse. Everything held. I was a week behind, but I wasn't beaten. I finished planting, and while the corn in that last field was a little shorter than the rest, it still made a crop. The total cost of the repair, aside from my own labor, was the $30 I'd spent at the auction and the price of a few gallons of gear oil and some new gaskets. A dealer would have charged me thousands. Dale Peterson would have just signed another loan paper. I had paid with sweat and skill. The boom rolled on, cresting in the early months of 1980. Land prices had doubled, then tripled. Farmers were using the inflated value of their land as collateral to borrow even more money, to buy even more land, driving prices up even higher. It was a spiral, and it was intoxicating. Dale Peterson was now farming nearly 1,000 acres. He had 2 new combines, that Steiger and a brand new John Deere 4640 to go with it. He was a local legend, the embodiment of success. I stuck to my 240 acres. I used the profits from the good years to build a new machine shed, a good, solid Morton building. I paid for it in cash. I replaced the worn-out engine in my Chevy pickup with a rebuilt 350. I did it myself over a weekend. I put money away, every month, into a simple savings account at the bank. The teller, a young woman who was used to processing loan applications for tens of thousands of dollars, always looked at my small deposit slips with a kind of pity. To everyone else, I was a failure, a man who had a golden opportunity and had been too timid to seize it. I was the cautionary tale fathers told their sons. You don't want to end up like old Frank Miller, stuck in the past, afraid to take a risk. They didn't see the zero balance in my loan book. They didn't see the peaceful nights I slept, untroubled by thoughts of interest rates and payment due dates. They only saw what I didn't have, the shine of new paint, the roar of a brand new engine, the illusion of wealth built on a foundation of debt. One evening in the fall of 1980, after a long day of harvest, I was in my shop, cleaning the grease from a wheel bearing. The radio was on, playing softly in the background. The music stopped for the evening news report. The announcer's voice was grave. He was talking about the Federal Reserve, about a man named Paul Volcker. He was using words I hadn't heard on the news in a long time: combating inflation, tightening the money supply, and the one that made the hair on my arm stand up, dramatically increasing interest rates. I stopped what I was doing, the greasy rag still in my hand. I stood there in the quiet of my shop, listening as the announcer explained that the prime interest rate had just jumped to over 15% and was expected to climb even higher. A cold dread, heavy and familiar, settled in my stomach. I'd heard stories from my father about the 1930s, about how fast things could turn. Out in his massive, brightly lit machine shed a few miles away, Dale Peterson was probably polishing the hood of his Steiger, laughing with a salesman on his new cordless phone about the next piece of land he was going to buy. He couldn't feel it yet, but the ground beneath his feet had just begun to crumble. The party was almost over, and the bill was about to come due. My old, paid-for iron sat silent in the darkness, waiting. It didn't need to be shiny, it just needed to be ready. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap, it was the opposite. It was silence, the silence of a sky that refused to rain. The summer of 1981 started hot and stayed that way. By mid-July, the corn leaves weren't reaching for the sun anymore. They were rolling up tight as cigars, trying to conserve every precious drop of moisture. The ground in my fields turned the color of ash and cracked open in patterns that looked like a dry riverbed. Day after day, I'd watch the sky, a searing, cloudless blue, and feel a knot tighten in my chest. A drought doesn't care if your equipment is new or old. It starves everyone the same. The difference was in the margins. My costs were fixed and low. Fuel, seed, and my own sweat. For Dale Peterson and the others like him, the drought was just one more enemy in a war they were already fighting against the bank. The news from the coasts was all about inflation. Interest rates on their operating notes, the ones they used to buy fuel and fertilizer, had been written on variable rate terms. When they signed the papers, the rate was 8%. Now it was 16, then 18. The numbers were changing so fast the bankers themselves could hardly keep up. Every tick upwards was like another turn of a thumbscrew. I saw Dale at the parts counter at the dealership one blistering August afternoon. He looked like a different man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a frantic, hunted energy. His face was thin, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. He was arguing with the parts man over the price of a hydraulic manifold block for his Steiger. $1,000? Dale's voice was sharp, cracking with disbelief. For a chunk of cast iron with some holes drilled in it? That's robbery. The parts man, a kid barely out of high school, just shrugged. That's what the computer says, Mr. Peterson. It's got to come from the factory in Fargo. Take a week to get here. A week? Dale ran a hand through his thinning hair. I'm in the middle of summer tillage. I can't be down for a week. Isn't there anything you can do? Sorry. It's a proprietary part. Nobody else makes it. Dale finally threw his credit card on the counter with a sigh of disgust. I was standing there, waiting for a simple 50-cent Woodruff key for the PTO shaft on my gleaner. When Dale saw me, a flicker of the old arrogance returned, mixed with a new, sour defensiveness. Something funny, Frank? He snapped. Not at all, Dale, I said quietly. Tough year. You have no idea, he muttered, grabbing his receipt. You sit over there on your little patch of dirt with your museum pieces. You're not really in the game. You don't know what real pressure is." He stormed out, the glass door banging behind him. I paid for my key, 53 cents with tax, and walked out into the shimmering heat. His words stung, but they were wrong. I knew pressure. I just didn't invite it to sit at my dinner table every night. Later that week, I drove past his place. The giant Steiger sat silent by the end of the field, a green behemoth crippled by one small, expensive part. The field behind it, half dissed, lay baking in the sun, the weeds already starting to reclaim the exposed soil. It looked like a monument to expensive failure. The drought broke in late August, not with gentle, soaking rains, but with a series of violent thunderstorms that swept across the plains. The rain came down in sheets, hard and fast, hammering the dry, curled crops and washing tons of my precious topsoil down into the ditches. What the heat hadn't killed, the hail and wind now tried to finish. The harvest of 1981 was a grim affair. Yields were down by a third across the county. My old Gleaner F chugged its way through my fields, the grain trickling into the hopper at a dishearteningly slow rate. But it was something. It was a crop. I hauled it to the co-op and took the price they offered, which was falling by the day. The Russian grain embargo had slammed the door on our biggest export market, and now a mountain of surplus corn and beans was crushing the price. $3 corn was a distant memory. We were lucky to get $2.50. For me, it was a break-even year. I wouldn't be putting much in the bank, but I wouldn't be taking anything out either. For Dale Peterson, it was a catastrophe. His low yields, combined with the collapsed prices, meant he couldn't even cover the interest on his loans, let alone the principal. The 1,000 acres he was farming weren't an asset anymore. They were a 1,000-acre liability, each one demanding fuel, seed, and interest payments he couldn't make. The first cracks in his empire were no longer hidden. They were chasms, and they were widening with every passing day. The winter that followed was cold and bleak, and not just because of the weather. A new kind of notice started appearing in the legal section of the county newspaper. Foreclosure sales. At first it was just one or two, names from the edge of the county you barely recognized. Then, by the spring of '82, it was a flood. Every week another family farm was listed, another generation's worth of work set to go on the auction block. The optimism of 1978 was dead and buried. In its place was a cold, quiet panic. The prime interest rate, the one the banks based all their loans on, hit an unbelievable 21%. It was a death sentence for anyone carrying heavy debt. Mr. Henderson at the Farmers' Trust, the same man who had been handing out money with a smile 4 years earlier, now sat behind his big oak desk with the grim expression of an executioner. He wasn't a bad man. Not really. He was just caught in the same machine as the farmers. The money he had loaned out wasn't his. It was his depositors. And the Federal Reserve was demanding its pound of flesh. Dale Peterson held on longer than most. He sold his wife's new car. He sold a 40-acre parcel of timber he'd inherited. He tried everything to service the monstrous debt he'd accumulated. But it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a bucket. The interest alone was compounding faster than he could pay it. The end came on a cold, wind-swept Saturday in April of 1983. I saw the sale bill tacked to the bulletin board at the co-op, printed on cheap pink paper. The name Peterson was in big, black letters at the top. The list of equipment was long and heartbreaking. It read like a catalogue of the latest and greatest machinery from just a few years before. The Steiger Cougar 3 was at the top of the list, followed by the 2 international combines, the John Deere 4640, the Kinzer planter, the Glencoe field cultivator. An entire farming life, inventoried and priced for liquidation. I went to the auction. So did half the county. It wasn't like that day in '78. There was no festive atmosphere, no smell of hot dogs, no swagger. The crowd was quiet, their faces grim. They were there as witnesses, as mourners, and maybe as vultures. Men who had clapped Dale on the back when he bought the Steiger now stood silently, hoping to pick up a bargain from his ruin. Dale was there, standing off to the side by himself, near the fuel tanks. He looked like a ghost. He was wearing an old, worn-out work coat, and he stared at the ground, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His wife and kids were nowhere to be seen. He was facing this alone. Slim Perkins was the auctioneer again, but his usual rapid-fire chant was subdued, almost respectful. He started with the smaller items, the tools, the wagons, the odds and ends. The bidding was slow, the prices painfully low. Then came the main event, the Steiger. It was parked in the same spot where it had been unveiled as a symbol of progress 5 years earlier. Now it was a tombstone. The paint was faded and scratched. One of the massive tires had a slow leak and was visibly low. A hydraulic hose near the articulation joint was wrapped in black tape, a makeshift repair. It looked tired and used up, just like its owner. Slim started the bidding high, trying to find a spark of the old optimism. "All right, boys, here she is, the king of the field. Who'll give me $50,000 for this powerhouse?" Silence. The only sound was the wind whipping across the barren yard. "40,000? Slim pleaded. "Come on, men. This machine was over 100,000 new." More silence. The farmers just shuffled their feet and looked down. No one had that kind of money anymore. More importantly, no one had the credit. The banks weren't lending. Finally, a lowball bid came from a salvage dealer from out of state. 20,000. Slim's face fell. He tried to work the price up, but there was nowhere to go. The salvage dealer bid against himself a couple of times, raising it in paltry $500 increments. 22,500, Slim said, his voice flat. Going once, going twice. I looked over at Dale. A single tear was tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stood there, watching his dream being sold for scrap value. "Sold," Slim said, his gavel falling with a dull thud that seemed to echo across the silent crowd, for $22,500. The salvage dealer walked over and slapped a magnetic sign on the side of the cab that read, "Midwest Salvage." The giant was tagged. It was officially scrap. I stayed through the rest of it, a knot in my stomach. I didn't bid on anything. It felt wrong. As the crowd began to disperse, I walked back to my old Chevy C20, the same one I'd leaned against 5 years before. The engine started on the first try, its familiar rumble a comforting sound in the midst of all that ruin. While Dale's empire was being dismantled piece by piece, I was heading home to do my evening chores. My farm wasn't booming, but it was solvent. It was whole. It was mine. The old iron in my shed, paid for with cash and maintained with sweat, had been my shield. It had kept the wolves from my door while they devoured the bigger, more impressive flocks all around me. A week after the auction, as dusk was settling over the fields, a pickup truck I didn't recognize pulled into my lane. It was an old, beat-up Ford, with a mismatched fender and a coat of primer a dozen different shades of grey. Dale Peterson got out. He looked even worse than he had at the auction, if that was possible. He walked toward my machine shed, where I was changing the oil on the 4020, moving with the slow, uncertain steps of a man who had lost his purpose. He stopped a few feet away, twisting a greasy cap in his hands. He didn't look at me, but at the tractor. The big side console, the familiar green and yellow paint, the engine block stained with the honest grime of thousands of hours of work. I heard you might be looking for some help," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I straightened up, wiping my hands on a rag. I could have said 100 different things. I could have reminded him of his words at the auction, about my museum and his progress. I could have told him to get off my property, but looking at the broken man in front of me, all the bitterness I'd ever felt toward him just evaporated. It felt like punching a man who was already down. "Could always use another pair of hands," I said, keeping my voice even, especially with planting coming on. He nodded, still not meeting my eyes. "I know my way around a planter." "I know you do," I said. I pointed to a bucket of solvent and a pile of greasy parts from the cultivator I was getting ready. "You can start by cleaning those up. Pay you $5 an hour, cash, at the end of each day." It was a fraction of what he used to make, but it was something. It was a start. He just nodded again, picked up a brush and went to work, his back to me. We didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. We just worked, the only sounds the clinking of metal tools and the cry of a killed deer out in the cooling air. My vindication wasn't in saying "I told you so." It was in this. It was in having a farm left to work on, and in having the grace to offer a hand to a man who had lost his. Dale worked for me all through that spring and summer. He was a good worker, quiet and diligent. He never mentioned his old life, and I never asked. We fixed fence, tilled the fields, and planted the crop side by side. He learned the quirks of my old equipment. He learned how to adjust the points on the Farmall M's distributor and how to fine-tune the seed drop on my old John Deere planter. He was learning a different kind of farming, not the kind from magazines and salesmen, but the kind born of necessity and self-reliance. The community noticed. The talk at the co-op changed. The men who had once pitied me now looked at me with a kind of baffled respect. They'd seen dozens of their neighbors go under, the big operators falling the hardest. And yet there was old Frank Miller, still farming, still paying his bills, even hiring the man who had been the poster boy for the boom that had busted them all. I never said a word about it. I just bought my seed, paid in cash, and went about my business. My balance sheet was my testimony. One day, Dale and I were in the shed, getting the Gleaner combine ready for fall. He was replacing a worn-out belt, his hands sure and practiced now. "Frank," he said, breaking a long silence. "I never thanked you." "Nothing to thank me for," I said. "It's honest work." "No," he said, looking up at me, his eyes clear for the first time in months. "You were right. That day at the first auction. You said the debt was a chain. I thought it was a ladder. I thought I was climbing. But I was just wrapping it around my own neck." He looked at the old combine. "This thing, it's not pretty. It breaks down. But when it does, we can fix it. Right here. With the tools on that wall. We don't have to call a dealer and wait a week for some computer chip to come from Moline." He had finally understood. It wasn't about the age of the iron. It was about control. About freedom. Dale eventually got back on his feet. He took a job managing the grain elevator at the co-op. His knowledge of farming was valuable, and he was good with the numbers, now that he'd learned the hard way what they really meant. He and his family moved into a small rental house in town. It wasn't the brick ranch, but it was a home. Sometimes I'd see him at the elevator, and we'd nod to each other, a quiet understanding passing between us. The land had humbled him, but it hadn't destroyed him. By the late 1980s, the storm had passed. The farm economy began to slowly recover. Land prices were at rock bottom. with the money I had carefully saved during the good years and stubbornly held on to during the bad, I bought the 80 acres next to me, a piece of land that had once been part of Dale's rented empire. I paid cash. It was the only way I knew how to do business. My son, Mark, had watched it all. He'd seen the shiny new tractors come, and he'd seen them hauled away on salvage trucks. He saw his friends' fathers lose their farms, their homes, their pride. He stayed. After he graduated high school, he told me he wanted to farm with me. One afternoon, years later, I found him in the shed. He was about 20 then, with my build and his mother's steady eyes. He had the carburetor from the old Farmel M disassembled on the workbench, its tiny jets and springs laid out neatly on a clean rag. He was carefully cleaning each piece, just as he'd seen me do 100 times. He looked up as I walked in. "Figured I'd get the old girl running a little smoother," he said. I leaned against the doorframe and watched him. "You know," I said, "we could probably afford a new utility tractor now. Something with a front-end loader." Mark picked up the main jet and held it to the light, checking to see if it was clear. "We could," he said thoughtfully. "Or we could put that money in the bank. This old M still starts, doesn't it? And if it doesn't, we know how to fix it." He looked at me and smiled. "I get it now, Dad. It's not about the new paint. It's about owning the title." I just nodded, a lump forming in my throat. The lesson had been passed down. The legacy was secure. Now I'm an old man. My hands are gnarled and stiff, but they can still tell by feel if a bolt is tight. I don't climb up on the 40-20 much anymore. My hips won't allow it. But Mark does, and sometimes his own son, my grandson, rides on the fender with him, his small hands gripping the faded green metal. The tractor is still the heart of this farm. Its engine has been rebuilt twice. The paint is almost gone in places, worn down to the primer by decades of sun and work. The seat is cracked, patched with silver duct tape. But it runs. Every spring, its 104 cubic inch diesel engine still roars to life, a deep, throaty song of survival. It represents every right decision, every dollar saved, every night spent in the shop instead of the bank manager's office. Some evenings, I sit on the porch and listen. I can hear the distant, steady rumble of it as Mark finishes the last round in the far field. It's more than the sound of a machine. It's the sound of our family. It's the sound of a legacy. It's the sound of being free,